Aí não exagera, né? É 17, né? Não, 18. Foi, saiu em dezembro? É? Da Cambridge. É Oxford que tem um escritório aqui em São Paulo. Não é Cambridge. Bom, boa tarde a todos e todas. Vamos começar dando as bem-vindas ao Simeon, Nitcher, né? O seminário dessa tarde. Ele está aqui no Brasil. Já faz um tempinho, né? Está fazendo pesquisa no Rio de Janeiro. Então não está acostumado com nossos ritmos, né? Ele veio apresentar o livro dele que saiu em 2018, em dezembro de 18, às vésperas de 2019. Então é bem recente, ok? A pesquisa dele é sobre clientelismo. O Nitcher tem vários textos, artigos sobre clientelismo não apenas no Brasil, na América Latina em geral, ainda que nos últimos tempos o amor dele seja mais o Brasil, o foco. Então, é um prazer tê-lo aqui, aproveitando a presença dele no Rio de Janeiro, na GV. Então, a gente conseguiu, né, esse dia meio conturbado vir para cá, né? Mas deu certo. Então, obrigado, Simeon. Quando você quiser falar, a gente quer estar aqui para te ouvir.
Perfeito. Muito obrigado pelo convite. Gostaria de agradecer a Universidade de São Paulo. Vou apresentar hoje em inglês, mas pode perguntar qualquer coisa em português, não tem problema não.
So today I'm going to present about vulnerability and clientelism. This is a paper co-authored with Gustavo Bobones, Paul Gertler, and Marco Gonzalez Navarro. So if I'm talking about clientelism, a lot of times people are thinking about vote buying, right? So you're on the way to vote, the day of the election, and someone comes up to you maybe in a dark alley and offers you 50 reais, 20 reais for your vote. So today what we're going to be talking about is more the demand side of clientelism. And what we argue is that citizens are often motivated by their vulnerability to request clientelist benefits. There's often the demand side that's too often overlooked. And what we do here today is we create a random exogenous shock and vulnerability by randomizing where water cisterns are built. Big water tanks that collect water off the roof. Also to provide some context for this paper, I'm going to talk a bit about my book that was just published. Okay. So I don't need to tell you that many rural Brazilians are very vulnerable to adverse shocks, whether that be
rainfall shocks or illness or loss of employment. And so we argue in this paper that vulnerability is a key cause of clientelism. Many Brazilians, especially in rural areas, rely on these ongoing clientelist relationships because of a lack of a social safety net that's adequate. And so amidst shocks, right, when there's a lack of rain, citizens are more likely to participate in clientelism. And therefore, when we reduce vulnerability, what we expect is a decrease in clientelist demands and also a reduction in incumbents' electoral performance. And the second being because incumbents typically have a comparative advantage at clientelism, right? So if you reduce demand for clientelism, they should receive less votes. And so again, what we do is, what's unique about this paper is that we use this RCT, this randomized control trial, where we randomize the placement of these water cisterns, which neighborhoods get them and which ones do not, in order to reduce vulnerability. And so what we find first is that these cisterns, which are individual cisterns given to households, that they reduce requests, particularly of citizens who are likely to be in these ongoing relationships. And also, what's really interesting is we're able to look at the most disaggregated level of votes by looking at the sessão eleitoral and find that the sessões with more treated voters, more people in the treatment group that were supposed to receive cisterns, there are fewer votes for the incumbent in those electronic voting machines, right? So we see this in the lowest level of data. So I know I can already see there's a few experts on clientelism in the room, but I'd be remiss if I didn't give just a very brief overview. So clientelism is this contingent exchange of benefits for political support. Now what I mean by that is in many countries, whether you get your Bolsa Familia, whether you get whatever poverty program, doesn't depend on what actions you as an individual take, right? But in many places, that's not true, right? So whether or not you go to the polls or you vote for a particular candidate may affect the benefits that you receive. If there's that quid pro quo exchange, that's what we mean by clientelism. Now, if you look at the traditional literature decades ago, the focus was really on these ongoing long-term relationships. But over the last decade or two, there's really been a shift in focus to looking at short-term targeting by politicians during campaigns, right? So you see this focus on vote buying, abstention buying, turnout buying, all these very short-term. Is that better? These elite targeting strategies are often mediated by brokers, and partisan networks often mediate these access to benefits. All right, so with that out of the way, let me say, first what we're going to do today is talk about vulnerability and clientelism, provide some context building on my book. Then going straight into our data, we'll look at the survey data and descriptive analysis. I'll move around and see where we get less feedback, right? Then we'll talk about the water cisterns intervention, and then go into the two outcome variables, both requests and voting outcomes. So, just to talk a bit about the overall project, first I'll talk about some qualitative research I did before the study, 18 months in the Northeast, primarily in Bahia. So these were in municipalities with up to 100,000 residents, where, as you know, almost half of Brazilians live in municipalities of this size. 132 interviews of both politicians and citizens. And so for this study, the Water Cisterns Randomized Controlled Trial, we had a 3-year panel of rural citizens that I'll talk about more how we did that, conducted for this RCT. And this was in 40 municipalities across 9 states in the Northeast. Okay, so let me just talk about vulnerability. What do we mean by vulnerability? We're focusing on economic vulnerability, which is not just low average income, poverty, but also the idea that there's uncertainty to income, right? This high uncertainty. And as you know, many Brazilians, especially according to PAN, especially in the rural Northeast, are vulnerable to things like drought, illness, unemployment. And I don't need to tell any of you that the social safety net is inadequate in many ways. Long before, and if you're watching the U.S. Primary debates, this idea of comprehensive universal health care is this big hot topic in the U.S. now. Well, you guys have long had it, right? At least in terms of the 1988 Constitution. Of course, if you look at popular opinion surveys, one of the top complaints is often the inability to get the benefits people need in SUS, right? But given decentralization, Brazil is one of the most decentralized countries in the world. Local politicians often have resources, at least some limited resources, and discretion to use them. And many vulnerable citizens rely on these ongoing clientelist relationships, asking politicians for help when they need it, right? For example, right, man can collect water, during, when it's rainy season, but then people are often reliant on the water trucks arriving. Politicians often offering these, so you're relying on the politicians when it's dry season. And the key here is this isn't constituency service in which you offer to everyone based on need, but rather often dependent on some form of political support. So let me give you an example from an interview that I did. Of course, I picked out a particularly eye-opening example, but this is something that often comes up during interviews. This was a woman who was pregnant. She had been feeling some abdominal pain. She went to her local health clinic, and they didn't have an ultrasound machine, so she wanted to go by a nearby municipality where they did have one, and the clinic refused to send her, so she went to her local vereador. And so here's the quote. Eu levei uma queda e estava sentindo dor, aí eu fui até o vereador, que eu pedi ajuda, ele falou que não podia ajudar porque eu não tinha votado para ele. Right? So this idea that it's this connection to your political support. Okay, so you can see this is very different than the vote buying, how I opened the talk, right? And so just to sort of put that distinction in sharp relief, I just want to show a figure from my book that distinguishes between this electoral clientelism, which is usually the focus of the literature, and what I call relational clientelism. So most of the time when people study clientelism, the key question they ask to define clientelism is, are the material benefits, what the citizen receives, is that contingent on the citizen's political support, right? So does it depend on that citizen providing some sort of support? And so if yes, it's clientelism. If no, it doesn't depend on the citizen's political support, it's not clientelism. So what I argue is it's really important to distinguish between whether or not those benefits extend beyond the electoral campaign. And so if it does, then it's what I call relational clientelism. If it's not, it's this electoral clientelism, which captures vote buying, turnout buying, abstention buying. Now, you'll notice there's a key difference here, right? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the literature that talks about, well, if you engage in vote buying, how do you know whether the person really votes for you? There's a secret ballot, so the politician can't see who that person's voting for. So there's this credibility problem on the side of citizens, right? How did the politician know whether they're really telling the truth about how they're going to vote? But you'll notice with the relational clientelism, of course, there's that. The politician worries about that. But the citizen is also concerned. Why? Because not all benefits are provided before the election. There's also this expectation of benefits extending beyond the campaign, and therefore the citizen is also worried about whether or not the politician will follow through on their promises. What I argue in this book is that citizens, motivated by their vulnerability, undertake at least two key actions, mechanisms that help sustain, that underscore the survival of relational clientelism. And these two mechanisms we talk about in this article for today. So the first being declared support, right? So what about that secret ballot? How does the politician know who the citizen's going to vote for? Well, you'll often see if you go to any municipal elections, especially in rural or in the interior, what you notice is that people will often have signs on their house and flags on their houses and wearing T-shirts and stickers. Now, of course, part of that is political preferences, but also it's a way of signaling to a politician that you're going to vote for them, right? Because if the politician is giving you some sort of clientelist benefit, they feel more confident that you're going to vote for them if you're declaring publicly your support. Also, another thing is citizen requests. So another mechanism that helps underscore the survival of relational clientelism is that citizens often request clientelist benefits. And the idea here being is, if you're a citizen and you've asked a politician for things, and they've turned you down in the past, you're not going to trust them, right? And so it's this track record of the citizen requesting things and being fulfilled that helps sustain clientelism. We'll talk about both of these today. Okay, so first, maybe it's obvious to some of you, but looking at the literature, there's really not much focus on citizens making requests. And so I just want to convince to those of you who don't believe it that it really is much on the side of the citizens. So a mayor, for example, said, quem pede ao eleitor não é candidato que oferece, right? An example also from TE Amazonas. This is a cartoon that the charge was in what they were handing out to politicians to warn them not to buy votes. And you can see they definitely recognize the role of citizen demands, right? Because you can see everyone lining up at the Comité Eleitoral, and you can see this guy even declaring support, right? He's got the candidate's face on his T-shirt. So in our survey, we found that 27% of these rural citizens had made a request for private good directly of a politician, either during the 2012 or 2013 year. And most of these requests had to do with vital needs like water and health care. We also saw a lot of construction requests. Now, I really want to, you might be thinking like, okay, yeah, sure, this mayor is going to say that he's not offering benefits, right? It's just these demands of the voters. I have to give these benefits. I was talking to a vereador doing an interview, and I hadn't said it directly, but I could see, probably by the questions I was asking, that I was a bit skeptical. And so, now this wasn't an interview that we had scheduled long in advance. He didn't know I was coming that day. And he said, but look, this note I had just gotten under the door this morning. And so let me read it to you. This is a note to the vereador from one of his supporters. And this was just about a month before the election. Estou precisando de material, uma porta com as duelas e a fechadura, 2 sacos de cimentos, uma tinta verde comum, às 8 horas eu irei na sua casa hoje. Right? So you can see this is a demand. This is what I want. And these aren't just one-time offers, right? It's this ongoing relationship, like this relational clientelism. Here is another vereador. Quote from another one: você teve 200 votos, sua família passa a ser 200 pessoas. Você tem obrigação de atender aquelas pessoas, porque o dia que você deixar de atender aquelas pessoas, você já perdeu aquele voto. Se for lhe pedir o remédio, você tem que dar. Se for lhe pedir a comida, você tem de dar. Se não dá, você perdeu aquele eleitor. Right? So this idea of this ongoing relationship, right? Okay, so remember, in this study today, what we're going to do is and I'll talk about the experiment in a second, the treatment, but we're going to provide these water cisterns to reduce vulnerability. So what are some hypotheses that we have about this? The first one being that if you reduce vulnerability, you're going to have a decrease in these demands, in these clientelist relationships. The reason being twofold. Remember, I talked about those two components of vulnerability, the poverty, the low average income, as well as the uncertainty of income. Well, both of those are what underscores like why people are making these demands, right? So if you look at poverty, we know from diminishing marginal utility of income that poorer people are going to get more value out of a given level of goods, and so therefore poorer people may be more likely to request bricks or whatever. Then also adverse shocks, right? It's these unexpected shocks which are causing people to request medicines, water, whatever else. And therefore, if you reduce this vulnerability, you're going to dampen both of these factors and decrease clientelist demands. The second thing we expect is, I've just told you that reducing vulnerability is going to decrease citizens' participation in clientelism. Well, then you also expect that to undermine incumbents' electoral performance. And the reason being is that clientelism tends to favor incumbents. There's a broad literature that talks about how incumbents can often use their access to government coffers, their ability to hire public employees, to use the resources of the state to win elections. And therefore, as you reduce weaken clientelism, you therefore expect these incumbents to lose votes. So that's what those two are what we're testing for. Okay, so now to turn to the data and the descriptive analysis. So what we do is we study the semi-arid zone in Brazil, which I'm sure many of you are familiar about, but this is outlined by the black line. The red dots are our survey locations where we did the surveys. right? So there's over 1 million square kilometers in Brazil. You can see this has the least amount of rainfall, which is why it's shaded in the light color. The dark is where the most rain is. As you know, these are primarily in northeast Brazil, a little bit of Minas Gerais as well. 28 million residents, primarily poor and rural. Over 1,133 municipalities across these 9 states. And a key point of why this is a really a good place to do this intervention where we introduce water cisterns to reduce vulnerability is it's not that there's no rain, right? Because the cistern wouldn't work too well then. It's that there is rainfall, although it's lower. You can see it's about 1/3 of the rest of Brazil. But it happens in downpours, right? It happens very quickly. And then because of the topography, it evaporates. And so the cisterns help collect this rainfall, right? Okay, so what we did is this representative sample of households without reliable water access. Our sampling frame, you know, the Cadastro Único. And so we stratified this at the municipal level. So we randomly selected 40 municipalities, weighted for the number of households without access to reliable water. And these are across 9 states. And then within these 40 municipalities, we randomly selected 425 rural clusters. Now, we chose clusters. These are the lograduros, if you look in the Cadastro Único, right? They're groups of homes that are typically within about, at most, about a 10-minute walk from each other. And we gave basically everyone in the cluster up to 6 homes a water cistern. If it was a treated cluster. And the reason is that otherwise you can't just do one household receiving, one household not, because they're going to share the water, right? So that's why we were treating it at a cluster. We're treating the lograduro. Of course, if it was a larger lograduro, we didn't have enough money to provide everyone in all the households. So it was up to 6 neighboring households that were in our study. The median cluster size was 4 of how many households there were in the lograduro. And each cluster was at least 2 kilometers away from each other to make sure that there wasn't water sharing between treated clusters, those lograduros that got cisterns, and the control clusters, which did not. And so, again, this is a cluster RCT. I'll talk more about this in a bit. But by municipality, we randomly assigned treatment across those clusters of homes. So it's an example of a cistern. I'll talk more about the treatment in just a second. Okay, so this is, any questions so far? Okay, so this is a timeline of the survey. There were 4 waves, 2 before the intervention, the cisterns intervention, and 2 afterwards. The localization survey, just to make sure the homes that were actually there and that they were eligible. The baseline survey, we collected a lot of socio-demographic as well as some political variables to make sure primarily that we had balance between treatment and control in the experiment. Then in early 2012, we rolled out on a rolling basis building these water cisterns. Then, as you know, there were municipal elections in October 2012, and then we did the wave 3, which is the first post-treatment wave, here in November, December of 2012, and then we did another one a full year later. And that's what's particularly interesting about this study is that we're able to look at clientelism not only during an election campaign, but also a full year afterwards. So the first 2 waves are of household heads, and then the next 2 were of all voting age individuals who are in the House. And as you can see, so it was 2680 and 1944 respondents respectively. Of the 1,308 households which were identified as eligible for participation, you can see attrition was quite low, 9.1% in wave 1, based on the first number, just 5.3% off of the 1308, and 14% in wave 3 off of the 1308. And also be talking about some results that use another source of variation, which is rainfall, right? So we use satellite rainfall to get municipal rainfall standardized by using the data over the last 25 years. Okay, so first thing I want to point out is that there's vulnerability to rainfall shocks, right? Because you might imagine, hey, maybe these citizens self-insure, or maybe the state is providing a really good social safety net, in those cases, you would expect no correlation between vulnerability measures and drought, right? But what these bivariate regressions show you is precisely the opposite, right? So these are just measures. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide because it's just to make a point that there is vulnerability to rainfall. So if you look at these depressive symptoms index, which is based on an international index where you ask people whether they have certain symptoms of depression, you can see that when there's less rainfall, right? So when there's less rainfall, which is a negative rainfall shock, a drought, you get more depression, right? Because depression is coded such that lower numbers are more depression. You can also see that self-reported health status goes down, how healthy people think goes down when there's a drought. Also, when there's no rain, children have more food insecurity, and you also see that household expenditures go down 24 reais. This is on how much people spent in the last month. And remember, these are rural households, and that 13 reais of that is in terms of food, and about 11.5 reais in terms of non-food expenditures. Bottom line here, which shouldn't be a big surprise, is that rural households are vulnerable to rainfall shocks, to droughts, right? That's key for our study, though. Okay, so let me just show you some other. Remember, what this is doing is this isn't anything randomized. This is rainfall, and we have these rainfall measures at a municipal level. So it's using cross-municipal variation in the level of rainfall, right, across our 40 municipalities. What you see is that when there's a drought, so if there's a 1 standard deviation reduction in water, you see that requests go up 3.9 percentage points, and that's significant at a 1% level. So people ask for more things when there's a drought, and you might expect that with water, clearly, but you also see that with medicine and medical treatments, and it's similar size, but imprecisely estimated for construction materials. So people ask for more things directly of politicians when there's less rain. You also remember that was one mechanism of the relational clientelism, but there was also the other, which is declared support, which is that way of signaling your political support to a politician. Well, you also see that declarations go up when there's drought, right? And so what this is, you can see that half of people had declared in some way, either on their body, on their house, or at a rally. And you can also see that for all of these at the 1% level, you see that declarations go up when there's a lack of rain. Right? So both of these are consistent with this role of relational clientelism. Okay, so I'm about to show you results about talk about the experiment and show you the results and the outcome measures. But I want to get to one key point, which is, remember, we want to show you that reducing vulnerability increases requests, particularly of those people in clientelist relationships. Now, for those of you familiar with the clientelist literature, there's no unambiguous marker used by everyone that says, okay, if you want to know whether someone's in a clientelist relationship, ask them this. There isn't that. Especially because people tend to focus on things like vote buying, right, which aren't these ongoing relationships. So we tackle this with a two-prong approach. The first thing we do is we use a measure which is asking the people, did they have conversations with a politician before the campaign started, right? So at least monthly conversations with a politician before the before the campaign started. So precisely we asked before São João. And so this marker 18, and so by marker what I mean is it's not saying that everybody who talks to a politician outside of campaign time monthly is in a clientelist relationship. What it's saying is that someone who has that behavior is more likely to be in a clientelist relationship than someone who does not have those conversations, right? And so it's not significantly related to rainfall shocks. So these things people don't just start talking to politicians when there's a lack of rain, but rather they're cultivated over time. And also important for us, it's not correlated with the cisterns treatment. And we also use an alternative marker, which is not only did you have to have those monthly conversations, but you also had to have declared support for a politician. You had to do both of those to be considered having a marker of a clientelist relationship. And everything's robust to that as well. I won't get into this now, but this basically shows that this marker is not just a proxy for something like your level of vulnerability. I'm happy to get to that later. Okay, so let's go straight into the water cisterns intervention, which I'm sure all of you are eager to hear about. So you guys have seen water cisterns, in Sao Paulo, they're primarily plastic, but when you go out, into the countryside, you see, these are concrete water cisterns, which we built in collaboration with the local NGO AZA. These are about the size of a room. They hold 16,000 liters of water. And so AZA had built these cisterns for at least a decade, so the cisterns are well known. We started building these in the partnership in January 2012 on a rolling basis. Took about 3 to 8 days each to build. Construction cost, well, here it says 1,000 reais. It was $1,000 at that time. It was 1,500 reais, which, as you know, is different now. 24 months of per capita consumption. And again, what we did here was this was a cluster RCT, stratified municipality. So what that meant, we took the Cadu Único, right, and we randomly selected those 40 municipalities based on the weights and how many households without that water access they had. And then within each of the 40 municipalities, there was another mini experiment, right? And what we did there is we randomly selected some lograduros that were controlled, that didn't get any cisterns, right? Of course, we didn't prevent if they... And then these other lograduros, which were the treatment cisterns, where everyone, up to 6, if they happen to be a very large lograduro, everyone received those, right? And then, of course, there were some other clusters, other lograduros that weren't in our experiment at all. Okay, so this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, basically just shows, first of all, that there was balance between treatment and control. So the experiment was, the randomization was executed well, and F-test can't reject the hypothesis that all the coefficients are jointly 0, so that's good for us. We also look at compliance here, and what you can see is of the 615 households, right in those clusters which were designated as treatment, 67% had received cisterns by November 2012, and then a year later, 91% had, right? Because here they were still being built, and then by there were some associations which were under AZA, which is this hedge, which didn't have as much building capacity as originally expected. You also notice in the control group of the 693 households that 20% had received water cisterns, not from us, from another source, by November 2012, and by November of 2013, 65% had received from another source, right? Because the federal government started ramping up funds for cisterns from other sources. Now, we deal with these issues of compliance by looking at standard in the literature at ITT estimates, right? So intent to treat. So we're not looking at comparing people with cisterns versus without, but rather looking at those that we intended to treat, right? So those that were selected to be in the treatment group and comparing those to the ones selected to be in the control group. And of course, what that does is it makes it more difficult for us to detect any treatment effects, right? Okay, so this one is not crucial, so I'll go quickly. But basically, just if the water cisterns did not reduce vulnerability, we'd be in trouble in this experiment, right? Because that was the point. We want to look at reducing vulnerability and what the effect is. But you can see here that it did. It reduced vulnerability. So you can see that the treatment, the cisterns treatment, receiving that cistern reduces depressive symptoms. It increases the reported health status, and also increases child food security. And if you look at this in terms of the overall index, where we standardize and add together all three separate, you can see at a 1% level that it does decrease vulnerability. So I won't go through this quickly. Bottom line is the cisterns treatment. Giving a cistern does reduce vulnerability, right? That's an important first step in the analysis. But let me turn directly to the outcome variables of interest. So first of all, remember what we want to show is that the water cisterns intervention, which reduces vulnerability, we want to show that it reduces requests, particularly of those citizens that are likely to be in those client's relationship, right? So what we first do is we just look at the average effect over the entire sample, right? And so the outcome variable is just an indicator. One, if the individual made a request either in 2012 or 2013, right? So this is a pooled data analysis where we stack both survey waves. The D is an indicator whether or not that individual was assigned to receive a water cistern. We include municipal fix effects because it was stratified at the municipal level, so we need to do that. We include survey wave fixed effects because the level of requests, as you saw, was different in each year. And then, in addition to these aggregate analyses, what we do is we interact the treatment with that indicator. Remember that marker of whether or not you're in an ongoing relationship? We look at that interaction to be able to see if that effect is particularly strong amongst citizens who are likely to be in those relationships. So we cluster the standard errors at the neighborhood level. Okay, so let me go straight. I'll show it first in a table, which I know is hard to read, which is why I also am going to show our results in graphically. But the key point here, first of all, is that the treatment effect, the cistern's treatment, reduces requests by 3 percentage points, right? And so this is a citizen making a request in either 2012 or 13. So it reduces it by 3 percentage points. And so remember, the key thing we want to look at is how does it differ between people in those with that marker of being in an ongoing client relationship versus the marker of those without, right? People who had not talked at least monthly with a politician. Well, you can see what's really interesting is that if you just look at those who did not have the marker, it was 1.2 percentage points decrease and not statistically significant. So not statistically distinguishable from zero. But if you look at those with the client's relationship, so you add these two, you get a 10.9 percentage point decrease, which is statistically significant at the 1% level, right? So you see almost an 11 percentage point decrease of requests in those citizens who have that marker. You can see also that if you separate out by year, the effects are strikingly similar, right? So 2.9% in 2012 aggregate decrease. Remember, it was 3% overall versus 3.1%, right? So between the 2 years, 2012 and 2013, we can't. The difference between those two is not statistically distinguishable. And then also what you see is similar effects whether you look at, remember, if you're just looking at those with the clientelist marker, you can see it's 10.2 percentage points in 2012, which is the election year, and a 11.8 percentage decrease in requests in the non-election year, right? So what's really interesting here is it's not just a campaign effect where getting a cistern, reducing your vulnerability, reduces requests during a campaign, the election, but also a full year after the campaign. So it appears to be a lasting effect. What we also do is that you may say, well, you showed me these requests, but you're giving a cistern, and a cistern is, of course, is going to reduce requests for water. So how interesting is that? So what we also do is we take out any requests that have to do with water, and there you still see the similar results, although they are mechanically smaller just because we've taken out those types of requests. But you'd see the relationship even when you exclude water from them. And all different types of goods have negative signs, as would be expected. Big picture, literally, is that if you look at the overall, that 3 percentage point, this water cisterns treatment reducing that vulnerability, reduced citizen requests by 3 percentage points. And it was nothing amongst the people without that marker being in a client's relationship. And you had about 11 percentage point decrease in requests of those with the marker. And you see similar results in 2012 and 2013. Right? Okay, so that was the first thing. So what do we see? We see that citizens, especially those in those clientelist relationships, seem to participate less in this clientelism. So what do we expect in terms of voting? As we mentioned up front, clientelism tends to favor incumbents, right? Because they have that comparative advantage at clientelism. So if you weaken clientelism, you expect it to undermine those incumbents' performance. So we look at how does the water cistern treatment affect votes for the incumbent mayor who's running for re-election, right? So the analysis will focus on those 21 municipalities in our sample where there was a mayor running for re-election. And what we did, which is really unique about this study, is that we asked in the survey for people's session electoral, right? And so that's something I've never seen done in a survey before here in Brazil. But we actually asked them, and people have to report this on their, if they're applying for Bolsa Familia, it's on the questionnaire that's filled out. So it's a common question that's asked. But we asked it twice. Also asked if people see people's ID card if they were willing to show it. And so we were able to link our survey respondents to 909 voting machines, right? To sessões eleitorais. And so the key idea here is that machines have a random number of people who are either in our treatment group or a control group, right? So the idea is this. So, I mean, you're all of voting age, and you all, right? So you all vote, so I don't really need to explain to you how voting works, but you know that it tends to be a school. There's different classrooms, and in each classroom, there's a machine, and that's a sessão eleitoral, which is an electronic voting machine, right? So the key here is that in one classroom, right, there's two classrooms here. These people lining up in this. Now, in one of those classrooms, there may be 3 voters who got the cistern, right, and 1 who's in the control group. But maybe in that other classroom, there's 3 citizens in the control group and 1 in the treatment group. And so we use that variation to estimate what the effect of the cistern's treatment was on votes, right? And so what we're doing is you may say, like, well, wait a second. People in this school may get a lot different votes than people in another school, which is why we're using polling location fixed effects. So we're only comparing across different machines in this school, but we're using them all with fixed effects, so then we're comparing the different machines in another school with each other, right? So more precisely, our outcome variable is votes for the incumbent mayor in 2012 in their re-election campaign in a given machine. And so our key independent variable is TV, which is how many treated individuals there are who are assigned to vote in that machine, right? So people in the treatment group who are assigned to receive a cistern, whose voting card tells them they have to vote in that machine. And then, but we have to control for EV, which is how many citizens in our experimental sample, right? In our study, how many of those citizens are assigned to vote in that given machine, right? So once we control for this, we're able to get an estimate of beta 1, which is what is the effect on incumbents' votes of 1 additional person assigned to the water cisterns treatment. We also control for RV, which is the overall number of individuals assigned to vote, because you might expect there may be some differential patterns in larger versus smaller machines. We also include that polling location fixed effect, which, as I described, so we're only comparing within different machines in a given school. We use clustered standard errors at the municipal level, and the findings are significant without any adjustments. However, what I'm going to show you are adjusted findings, and the reason is that you may say, well, you went to, you didn't interview everyone in those households, and maybe there are other voters, and so we decrease the estimates for that reason. And so they improve the measurement of the treatment effects, but as the paper shows, everything holds up without any adjustments at all. So let me just give you the big picture here, which is, do you see in treated, right, in places with more, in the voting machines, sessões eleitorais, which more people in the treatment group, do you see less votes for the mayor? That's exactly what we see. We see for each additional person in the treatment group, 0.29 fewer votes for the incumbent mayor, right? So big effects, 29 percentage point effect. And you may wonder, well, and that's significant at the 5% level. So where do those votes go? Do they go to challenger candidates? We do see a similar, a bit smaller effect in the positive direction of a 0.20 increase of votes for challenger candidates, although it's more imprecisely estimated. But we don't see any effect on turnout or blank and null votes. Remember, we were talking about this idea of like heterogeneity across that marker, right? So do you see, you may wonder, well, do you see more of a loss of votes in those machines with more with more citizens with that marker being in a clientist relationship? I should say, first of all, that it's a much lower powered to look at this because it relies on having machines with those with citizens with that marker of clientelism, and only 1/10 of machines have any treated voters with that clientelist marker. However, when you look at it, you do see, although it's not significant, you do see signs in the direction consistent with our argument, which is that it's primarily the sign is about double for the treated response with the clientelist relationship compared to treated response without, right? So it's primarily the effect of loss of votes for the incumbent is primarily coming from those machines with the treated voters in clientelist relationships, or at least with that marker. Okay, so let me just quickly summarize so that we can open it up for discussion. First, bottom line here, vulnerability motivates many Brazilians to participate in clientelism, at least in the rural Northeast. And so the citizens' experiment allowed us to exogenously shock, to have a reduction in in vulnerability, to look at these causal effects. And what we see is a decrease in requests for private benefits, specifically amongst those citizens who are most likely to be inclined to this relationship, those with those markers. What we also saw, looking at that most disaggregated level of votes in Brazil, is that citizens lead incumbent mayors to lose votes in their mayoral re-election campaigns. And so this leads us to sort of ask some questions, and you may wonder, well, this may be why income effects, this is a point that I argue in the book, is that this is why income often does not curb, income gains don't curb clientelism on their own if vulnerability persists, right? If you still have this exposure to these shocks, you may still rely on these clientelist relationships even if your income per capita goes up. And also, it provides yet another example of why politicians, in many cases, may not have full incentives to provide the full protection, the social insurance. Right? All right, well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to open up to any questions. E pode perguntar em português se preferir.
Bom, vamos abrir a sessão de perguntas, por favor.
Não todo mundo no mesmo tempo, por favor.
Vamos. Perguntas simples, complexas. Não precisa ficar com vergonha. Pode ser uma perguntinha. Obrigado. Pode vir aqui? Então, eu vou até você. Pode ser?
Obrigada pelo paper. O desenho de pesquisa é super bem feito. Então, a minha pergunta fica um pouco como curiosidade da sua pesquisa de campo. No começo da sua apresentação, você disse que você relatou sobre um prefeito que se negou a ajudar, não tenho certeza agora se era um prefeito ou um vereador, mas um político que se negou a ajudar uma eleitora porque ela supostamente não teria votado nele nas eleições. Eu não sei, eu tendo a achar que isso é um pouco contraintuitivo, porque eu não me lembro de qual é o cargo, né? Se foi prefeito, talvez não. Mas se ele for um vereador e ele quisesse concorrer de novo às eleições, então faria sentido ele conceder o benefício para conquistar o voto dessa eleitora, possivelmente. queria ouvir um pouco quais são as suas experiências de campo em relação a isso, assim.
Vou perguntar em inglês, porque eu sou falante de inglês nativo. So I'm not an expert on clientelism. I also found the research super interesting. My question is, with sort of vulnerability being this causal effect, I'm assuming that like in mass, Bolsa Familia, like in a general sort of like country level reduction of vulnerability, you would observe a sort of overall really enormous effect sort of everywhere. Is there any good literature, or is there a sort of like clear response about how Bolsa Familia has affected local clientelist relations?
So I can start. Just let me get at both of those. So first of all, great questions. In terms of the response, and so yes, it was a video though. The quote you're responding to is about the ultrasound and the pregnant woman. And so first of all, there's a huge debate in the academic literature about whether politicians adopt a core or swing strategy. So, do you provide benefits to people who've always voted for you, or those people that you want to switch? It's definitely not unilateral in terms of when you talk to people. Some politicians, I talked to 55 politicians, and some people adopted some of one strategy and other people adopted the other. But something that I would often hear is that, listen, if you had unlimited resources, of course you would try and give it to everyone. There'd be a lot of persuasion, right? Trying to get people to come over your side who aren't currently on your side. But it tends to be easier to keep those people who are already on your side than it is to gain new people. And the problem is that people are often not loyal if you deny them. So I remember one politician gave me a really vivid example. He was explaining that, listen, you can be helping a voter for a long time and you give him a bicycle. But then if it comes down to the campaign and he gets a flat tire on that bicycle, and you say, no, I'm not going to give it to you because it's the election campaign or whatever, and someone else gives it, like they can switch away. So there's this real pressure to continue providing those benefits to your core, even though, of course, you would like to, if you have extra money, to go after the swing. In terms of the effect of Bolsa Familia, so the first thing I would say is, although it can certainly be a substantial amount of money for the people who receive it, it's by no means anywhere near the money you need to get over your vulnerability to various shocks, right? People get a lot more money from things like BPC or like the benefits per person of people who receive them is much higher of BPC or even from rural pensions, right? From people who are older. Not to say that Bolsa Familia hasn't had an effect. It has. There's a recent paper by Anderson Frey, which is really great in many ways, published just last month in Journal of Political Economy. And what he uses is basically this discontinuity based on population thresholds in terms of a health program, and is able to show that there were electoral effects of the Bolsa Familia program, which he has a nice model which ties it to clientelism. And his argument is that it's due to a shift against clientelism, although there's no measures empirically of clientelism in the paper. But you do see the effects that are consistent in terms of the voting patterns. So the broader point I would argue is that clientelism is ongoing. And people, a lot of the people in our study, have Bolsa Familia, so it's not. Clientelism continues with Bolsa Familia. Now, it's not that Bolsa Familia. A lot of people sort of argue that is Bolsa Familia clientelistic. I think it's shining a light in the wrong place, because of course you're going to find some examples of places where it's used in an incorrect way. Look, even there's no reason you should be asking for the sessão eleitoral on the application for Bolsa Familia, right? There's no reason you should be asking that. And people do say, I would ask directors of social service in these small municipalities, is there a way to have someone not get Bolsa Familia if you don't want them to? Sure, you can just put their form on the bottom of the pile, like when you're putting them in, right? But I think that's shining a light in the wrong place because it's compared to other social programs, it's amazingly well targeted. But there isn't, I think, well, other than that paper, which is suggestive, Bolsa Familia does not reduce vulnerability enough to stop this relational clientelism, which is why you see it surviving in spite of small increases of income.
Que mais, por favor? Depois o Jonathan.
Eu tenho duas perguntas bem bobinhas, na verdade. Como a Graça já falou, a pesquisa tem um desenho super bem feitinho e tal. Então, as minhas perguntas são mais só até para aprender, né? A respeito de duas escolhas que vocês fizeram na análise. A primeira é que, se eu não me engano, você disse que as estimativas são de ITT, né, de Intention to Treat. E se eu me lembro bem, sei lá, das minhas aulas de método, isso me levantou a dúvida porque vocês não fizeram um desenho de variável instrumental. Se você tem as estimativas de ITT, você poderia calcular, né, usar como instrumento para calcular o efeito do tratamento. Então, fiquei com essa dúvida. E a segunda, mais bobinha ainda, eu acho que na tabela que você mostra o balancing das variáveis, tem uma diferença significante, né, que é ter, se o seu vizinho tem uma cisterna, né, e os tratados, o grupo de tratamento tem uma proporção maior de vizinhos com cisternas. E da minha dúvida é se vocês, se isso é razão para preocupação de vocês, foi razão de preocupação para vocês, possivelmente haveria um confounding aí ou não, ou essa diferença da proporção é pequena, ou não sei, se não haveria nenhuma razão teórica para esperar que essa diferença fizesse, né, tivesse acarretasse algum problema, né, na estimação dos efeitos e tal. Então, essas duas perguntinhas bem simples.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. I think my question is kind of just a sort of next steps question almost. Like, what would be the general equilibrium effects of these changes on the electoral clientelist market more generally, right? Because you're showing us this reduction in demand, which is super important, but super simple supply-demand diagram, right? I wonder what, the price is going to go down for these transactions, the overall equilibrium quantity is going to go down. Do you see any evidence of that in practice, that even in the control group or in nearby locations, that you see shifts in the clientelist market because the overall market demand is going down? And in particular, I guess this idea that, I'm totally with you, this idea that clientelism is a demand-based thing as well, right? It's a relational process and that voters demand it throughout the 4-year term. But what turns it from being sort of constituency service to being clientelism is that the supplier puts this conditioning on it based on political behavior, right? And that's not coming from the voter necessarily, right? I know you have declared support, but there has to be some kind of screening by the politician to turn this into clientelism. And so was there anything in either the data or the qualitative interviews that showed that these shifts in the market are actually either, shifting the targeting or shifting the price of these transactions or eliminating them altogether by reducing the conditionalities? I think that'd be super interesting to see. Thanks.
Okay, so great questions from both of you. So yes, we do focus on the ITT effects. We have a table in the back that does show what it is when we do it instrumentally to look at the late. So when you look at the local average treatment effect, of course it goes, it's still statistically significant. It's the effects rather than being, in the 10 to 11%, it's more in the 24 percentage point. So it's much larger effects, as you would expect, and statistically significant. The reason we don't focus on those is because then it's going to open us up to a lot of people saying, well, how do you know that the citizens who receive those cisterns aren't the ones who are closer to the centro or more politically connected? And so by focusing on the ITT, it lets us table all those sorts of issues, which is why we do. But we do show the results in the paper. In terms of, and I can tell you're reading the paper very carefully, in terms of there is the one difference of whether the Vizinho has a cistern. So then you do see a small 6 percentage point difference, but it is statistically significant. You would certainly expect that one out of, right, I don't know what we're showing there, about 30 different measures would be statistically significant at a 5% level. However, what we also do is we show in another appendix table that all the results hold up if we control for that variable, as well as in others controlling for various socioeconomic variables as well. So it doesn't have any effect there. In terms of the general equilibrium effects, I mean, you're quite right. Like, you would definitely expect that if you were to build lots of these cisterns, you would expect that politicians would respond in some way. And what we're able to argue, because of our paper, we argue it and then also show it, is that, look, our experiment only built 17 cisterns on average in each of these 40 municipalities. And the average population size of these municipalities was 47,000, right? So it's such an imperceptible number of households that were changing to have any impact. What we do is we show that if you look at things like, okay, what are the types of politician responses you might expect in terms of clientelism? Is there any treatment effect, for example, have any supply side effect on how many campaign visits they make? How many offers of vote buying do they do? How many offers of any types of benefit, whether any benefits are received? All those sorts of things of looking at the supply side, and there's no effects across the board. But that's because it's so small. It's in no way to say that it wouldn't have an effect, and we definitely do expect that it would. In terms of your question about that clientelism has this, so it's definitely true definitionally that clientelism has this contingency. It's a core part of the definition, this conditionality of you only get it if you get this part. The one thing I would say is that usually how we measure clientelism, if you really look at most studies, is not that there's some empirical measure of that conditionality. What you do is you tend to look at, do people with a particular, do swing voters or do core voters, like people are looking at whether things are targeted on some sort of partisan basis, which is why things like whether declared support or other things come into play. Like, for example, in the book, which uses the survey as well for part of the data, as well as another one that looks online across Brazil, shows, for example, that you're more likely to get benefits if you've declared support. And also both in terms of actual and also in terms of perceptions. And so in terms of this paper, what we have are the markers of clientelism to examine it. But I would actually say that goes beyond what many studies do, is that you don't tend to see questions about the conditionality.
Okay, Fernando?
Peraí. I was wondering about the definition of clientelism and what type of services or benefits would classify as clientelism. The examples you gave are all private goods given personally by the politician from his own pocket, it seems, like the bicycle, like the construction stuff. So these are not resources from the state that are deviated to benefit some citizens. So I was wondering if this enters or not I don't know if it's the concept or whatever, what typifies clientelism. And given that the examples were most private goods or that were given, so there is a budget constraint on the side of the politician, right? And there is so many people that he can reach with this strategy. So I was wondering, is this what is really decides election or not? What is the percentage of votes that you can buy this way? And also, if we, or if you observe it in your studies, filtering of services being provided, like hospital, well, you gave an example of taking someone to the hospital, right? So there's this also this possibility of filtering services that would be universal, that are provided for the supporters. So I was just trying to elaborate in this distinction, because one gets out of the pocket of the politician, right? The other one does not. It comes from discriminating the provision of services to the citizens and saying, well, this is my citizen, this is not my citizen, this receives, this does not receive. But so this one would not have this budget constraint, but the other one does, right? So then I wonder if it's efficient or it's profitable to the politician, whatever. And a second question, or well, the first one was not really a question; it's just trying to understand it. The second one is regarding the core and the swing vote answer you gave. So it seems that vulnerability does not change the dominant strategy, right? So it's the same, because in the general literature, you focus on the core, or there are some people that argue that you go to the swing, but the logic is the same. Is there anything that changes the logic in this strategy if the citizens are vulnerable or not?
Ok. Mais alguém? Ok. Então, mais uma? Posso fazer a última?
Pode. Mas eu vou responder primeiro e depois.
Ok.
Perfeito. So first of all, so I wouldn't differentiate, people have in the literature, I wouldn't differentiate between the private goods, by whether it's provided by the politician's own pocket or not. There certainly have been studies that have done that. In what you find, what I found in my interviews is that it's both, right? There's certainly the instances of using SUS benefits or whatever else for it. I mean, I have a paper on the use of sterilization, right? Laqueaduras for that, right? You see that's being used as a clientelist benefit. But at the same point, you also see a lot of, vereadores will have, there won't be medicine at the farmácia popular, and so they'll be using part of their salary to have a special account at the private pharmacy where they can send their supporters. So both of those happen. And I would argue, but your point about the budget constraint, I think, applies to both, because there's only a certain number of people that get the surgeries and a certain number of people that will get it out of their own pocket. And so that, in terms of your second question, which is, in terms of that budget constraint, is it really what decides an election? So people are using all the strategies, right? So on the one hand, people don't talk. When you go to rallies, at comicios, people aren't on the stage talking about how many clientelist benefits they're giving out, right? That's just, because it's just going to make people jealous of who's getting them, who's not. They don't have enough money to give everyone benefits. And so there's a lot of voters of conscience, right? Who, you talk to them, they think clientelism is terrible, they would never vote for a clientelist candidate, et cetera, and they're appealing to those. And at the same point, most politicians you talk to will tell you that that's not going to win you an election, that you also need to have a base of voters that you're sustaining, at least in these smaller municipalities, in order to win elections. And then at the same time, not all, but some politicians, they'll tell you it's a gamble, but on the day of the election, they don't know if they're going to be, elections in Brazil are hugely competitive. And so they'll go out and buy some votes at the last minute too. So all these strategies are used. I would say that in many municipal elections in these areas that they can be definitive, but they're by no means the only strategy that they're using. It's not partisan, right? If anything, in many municipalities, it tends to be one family versus another, one group versus another group, and they'll often have names sometimes of animals that of what their groups are, and the politicians often, when I'll ask them, it'll be some random party, and of the existing mayor or of a vereador. I'll be like, where'd you get that party? And I go, well, I needed a party to run under, and so I knew someone in the capital, and he hooked me up with this this party. So it's not necessarily partisan that they're running on, but it'll still be on. I'm going to bring these collective goods to the municipality. In terms of I also just want to say in terms of so these are looking at private goods though. In terms of, you said definition, what services benefits. So we did specifically ask what goods, after asking, did you receive a benefit? Did you ask for a good? Then did you get it? Also asked them about each request, what was requested. And so we separated out any collective good like public lighting, public schooling, right? So if it was school materials for you, that would be in our, and we didn't see any effects on, well, first of all, collective requests were very small. That's not what people tended to ask for. And we didn't see any effects. In terms of your other question, about whether vulnerability changes the logic. So I would say the big it's an interesting question. I haven't gotten that. What I would say is this. I would say a big shift is looking at the role of citizens. So I would say that is when you look at the core versus swing, I think that, and maybe it's implicit in the paper, I didn't emphasize as much, but also the book. So another big focus is that typically you look at the supply side, what the politicians do, right? So there's always this issue in the literature of like, well, why does it make any sense? And this is partly where the question came from. Like, why would it make any sense for a politician to go after their core supporters, someone who's like tried and true, votes for them and is their partisan? Like, why are you going to provide them any benefits? They're your captive audience. Like, it doesn't make any sense. You should go after the swing and try and get them over. And so that's where, for example, the literature on the brokers has come from, because that one really nice thing about Susan Stokes and Thad Dunning's and Nazareno book is that it shows very nicely, and Brusco shows very nicely how you could have, it may well be that the top party leaders want to target swing voters, but then these brokers find it easier to go after their core, and that's why they provide them. But if you look at it from citizens having agency, it provides a very different reason for why, and partially complementary reason, for why you might target your core. It's not targeting. Targeting is the wrong way to look at it. So these people are coming up to you and demanding things. You have to provide them because they're agents. They're not like these captive audience. They're going to come and demand things of you. If you don't provide it, they're going to switch to someone else. So I would say that is the big distinction in the targeting logic. In terms of vulnerability, I would just say it's something that motivates the clientelism itself. And I guess because the vulnerability then, at least to the extent that it pushes the demand side, it provides one more reason why you would target core. Although if someone were going from arguing, looking at a supply side, they could also argue some of the same arguments that are put forth about poverty to vulnerability, because poverty is one element of vulnerability. So it doesn't nicely map onto one targeting strategy or the other, although it certainly gives a motivation, which is what we argue in this paper and I argue in the book, motivation for citizens to take those actions that sustain clientelism, at least relational.
Bom, vamos encerrando. Uma pergunta rápida, né? Que vai além do paper. É sobre o conceito de clientelismo. Vocês distinguem entre clientelismo eleitoral, né, e o relacional. Na verdade, os dois se confundem frequentemente, né? Mas eu queria te perguntar, porque o conceito em si de clientelismo é uma constante, né, para quem estuda a dinâmica eleitoral desde o século XIX até hoje, né? Você não acha que é uma provocação, né? A ideia de relação se aplica muito mais ao século XIX do que ao século XXI? Coronel?
So, you're stealing my thunder. No, it's perfect. I'm just joking. No, I mean, I think that's the exact response, right? Is that if you look at, I fully agree that this focus on electoral clientelism, the vote buying, all this stuff, it's kind of like I don't want to call it a distraction, because it is very important. And I mean, I've written a bunch on it. I've spent a lot of my own energy in recent years studying it as well. So it is definitely an important thing. But yes, if you look at the overall flux of history, the ongoing relationships have been much more important. But I know a lot of your research studies about many times in which citizens did not have the full agency, right? So whether it was currais eleitorais, voto de cabresto, where this idea of citizens demanding and saying, I'm going to go vote for someone else, it was a political monopoly in most of these times, in which there wasn't this high level of competition in which people, and even if there was, they may have been locked in rural bonds in which they had to vote for a particular candidate, otherwise they would lose their livelihood. And now, I mean, you go, and we were talking about this a bit earlier, you go, I would ask people in interviews, in Ari Rural, a community in like way out in Bahia, Shiki or something, places way out there, and you go in a rural area and ask people about currais eleitorais, or, and people vote differently. A father and a daughter will vote differently. Like, there's no, the idea that a politician tells them who they have to vote for. Like, politicians and citizens overwhelmingly, say, that's a thing of the past. That doesn't exist anymore. So that is what I would say is the key difference. And that's something I have to sort of emphasize, in the book, is that, what's new is not the idea of that some clientelism goes on during non-election time. Duh, like, of course, right? But if you look at the recent literature, people seem to have forgotten that. Like, most papers are totally silent about elections, about non-election periods. But what's different from that historical literature is this idea of not just looking at citizens as bit players who take or leave whatever offers the politicians or the representatives give.
Bom, agradecemos a presença do Simeon. Só um aviso para terminar. O próximo seminário foi cancelado pela conjuntura. Vamos ter a semana da graduação. Então, para permitir a participação dos professores nos eventos daquela semana, o seminário do Jonathan será no dia 14 de novembro. Ok? Obrigado.
Obrigado a vocês.
Agradecido.
Good questions.